You've probably heard ancient people died around 30, like the species raced some invisible clock. That number is real, but it hides something stranger underneath. Historians didn't invent 30 from nowhere. It comes from burial sites and bone records, averaged across thousands of excavated skeletons pulled from the ground. Now here's where it gets interesting. That average includes every baby who never reached their first birthday, and a staggering number never did. Most people assume the opposite. Ancient adults weren't simply dropping dead at 30 from old age. Infant deaths dragged that average down hard. So if you survived childhood, your odds improved dramatically. Let's tour the ancient world and see how long people lived once they cleared that danger. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers who survived childhood commonly lived into their 60s, still hunting, gathering, and raising families decades past the age most assume was ancient. Some hunter-gatherer groups treated their oldest members as living libraries, believed to hold knowledge nobody else in the tribe had time to memorize. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups found roughly 7 in 10 adults living past 60, a striking figure that quietly rewrites the whole 30-year myth. Picture it, you're 60, still hauling firewood, still outrunning your own grandkids, and somehow modern documentaries keep insisting you should already be dead. Somewhere along the way, someone figured out this pattern holds up again once you check it against other ancient societies far from the open grasslands. Neanderthal skeletons show a far harsher pattern, with brutal injuries and broken bones, evidence many individuals died young from violent encounters with massive Ice Age animals. Some researchers believe Neanderthal groups deliberately cared for badly injured members long-term, based on healed fractures on skeletons that could never have survived completely alone. One famous Neanderthal skeleton, nicknamed the Old Man, was missing an arm and partly deaf, yet lived for years, clearly cared for by others. Even without hospitals, Ice Age medicine, or a single painkiller, somebody in that cave was basically running an unpaid nursing shift for years. But that's not the wild part. The story gets stranger the further back you look, and ancient river civilizations tell a different version entirely. In ancient Egypt, elite adults who survived childhood illness and Nile parasites often lived into their 50s and 60s, several pharaohs reaching old age. Egyptians believed the heart was weighed against a feather after death, meaning how a person lived mattered more to them than how long they lived. Rameses II reportedly lived past 90, ruling for over 60 years, at a time many assume nobody survived long enough to meet their grandchildren. Now consider what that meant. This is a man who outlived several of his own sons, which sounds like an exhausting family reunion every year. Here's what actually happened next. Once you cross the desert and follow the rivers into Mesopotamia, where record-keeping got even more obsessively detailed. Sumerian and Babylonian clay tablets recorded property, marriages, and deaths in careful detail, showing many adults living well into their 50s in crowded, disease-prone cities. Mesopotamians believed the gods had simply assigned humans a shorter lifespan than divine beings, so illness and death were treated as expected, never as shocking. One surviving Babylonian legal tablet lists a woman managing her late husband's estate at an estimated age of 60, still actively running the entire household. Somehow this 60-year-old widow left behind more paperwork than most modern people generate across an entire career, historians still arguing over how. Think about surviving that, city after city, plague after plague, then picture what unfolds once Greek city-states enter the story entirely. Ancient Greek philosophers who avoided war and plague frequently lived into their 70s and 80s, several major thinkers still writing and teaching in old age. Greeks believed a person's true character could only be judged at the very end of life, since fortune could still ruin everything up until death. Sophocles reportedly wrote one of his most celebrated plays past the age of 80, decades beyond the lifespan most people assume ancient writers ever reached. Imagine still hitting your writing deadlines at 80, while everyone around you assumed you'd been dead for decades already, quietly proving them wrong. This is where the story splits, because not every Greek city wanted its people living long, comfortable lives, and Sparta made that painfully clear. Spartan men who survived brutal training and constant warfare could still reach their 50s and 60s, though the state made early death a real risk. Spartans believed dying young in battle counted as glory, so families were expected to mourn quietly rather than grieve loudly, the way other Greeks did. Spartan elders on the council called the gerousia had to be at least 60 to qualify, proof the harsh system expected some men that long. Most ancient people had to earn survival somehow, but Sparta said you must be this old and this terrifying to sit on our council bench. Now here's the twist most people never hear yet, because Rome took this entire obsession with age and turned it into a formal legal system. Roman senators frequently governed into their 70s and 80s, and Roman law assigned specific legal privileges based on how old a citizen had become. Romans believed old age brought accumulated wisdom the young simply could not fake, so senators often held more real political power than younger, stronger citizens. The philosopher Seneca wrote entire essays about aging well, at a time when the average Roman citizen often lived past 60 if spared by disease. And once you know this, everything makes more sense, since Rome's retirement plan was apparently never retiring and arguing in the Senate until you dropped. Here's a detail nobody quite expects next, because someone figured this pattern out east of Rome too, in the record-keeping empires of ancient China. Han Dynasty census records from ancient China tracked household ages in detail, showing officials and farmers routinely living into their 60s across the empire. Confucian tradition placed enormous respect on elders, teaching that a household's oldest member deserved deference no younger family member was ever allowed to question. Han officials granted elderly citizens a carved staff as a formal symbol of status, a real object marking how old and respected someone had become. Turns out the ultimate status symbol in Han China wasn't gold or silk. Apparently it was owning one seriously fancy walking stick. But that was not easy everywhere, and further south, the Indus Valley left behind its own quiet, mysterious version of this same old-age story. Indus Valley cities like Mohenjo-Daro had advanced sewage systems and planned wells, and skeletal remains suggest residents avoided many diseases that killed people young elsewhere. Very little written record survives explaining Indus Valley beliefs about aging, since their script remains undeciphered, so historians rely almost entirely on the bones themselves. Some historians believe the city's advanced sanitation, rare for its era, may have quietly extended average adult lifespans by preventing common waterborne disease. This civilization had working drains and planned sanitation thousands of years before some cities we consider modern figured out the very same idea. And this is where it gets uncomfortable in a different way, because further south along the Nile, Kush was running its long-lived royal line. The Kushite kingdom of Nubia produced ruling queens called Kandakes who governed for decades. Skeletal evidence showing many royal individuals reaching their 60s and beyond. Kushite tradition treated a long-reigning queen as proof the gods favored the kingdom, so surviving into old age on the throne carried real religious weight. Queen Ammonirnas reportedly led armies against Roman forces and is believed to have ruled for decades, well past what many assume ancient rulers achieved. Somewhere along the way, someone figured out that Rome, an empire that conquered half the known world, had to negotiate peace with this one queen. Now here's a twist worth crossing an ocean for, because the Maya built an entirely different relationship between age, rulers, and the passing of time. Maya rulers recorded on stone monuments sometimes reigned for 50 or 60 years. Skeletal analysis showing elite individuals regularly outliving the assumed 30-year ancient lifespan. The Maya tracked time in enormous cycles, believing a ruler's long life sent a message from the calendar gods that the kingdom's fortunes remained aligned. Maya King Pakal the Great is believed to have ruled for around 68 years, one of the longest documented reigns in the entire ancient world. Some scholars spent years arguing over his real age, purely because nobody could believe a single ruler had lasted on the throne that long. Further north tells a different story, because the Aztec Empire built its entire calendar around a far harsher relationship with time and mortality. Aztec commoners who survived frequent warfare and disease outbreaks could live into their 50s, while priests and nobles, shielded from combat, often reached older age. Aztec belief held that the sun required constant renewal through ritual, so a long human life was seen as a debt owed to the gods. Aztec elders who reached old age were legally permitted to drink pulque, a fermented ceremonial drink otherwise restricted, a real privilege tied directly to survival. Imagine surviving that just to earn one very specific legal right, being old enough that society finally said fine, go ahead and have a drink. Proving yourself young was only half the challenge, and far north in the cold, Viking Age Scandinavia had its own surprisingly long-lived elders too. Viking Age skeletal remains show men and women who survived raiding years and childbirth complications, often lived into their 50s and 60s on their farms. Norse tradition held that only those who died violently in battle earned a place in Valhalla, meaning many elders hoped for a long farm life. Viking law codes describe elderly farm owners formally transferring land to their children, real legal proof many Norse elders lived long enough to plan retirement. Apparently surviving the raiding years, just to spend your golden years arguing over fence lines, with the neighbors still counted as a genuine win. One more crossing awaits, back over the sea to Iron Age Britain, where the climate alone made survival its own constant, grinding negotiation. Iron Age Britons who survived harsh winters and tribal conflict frequently lived into their 50s, farming and herding land their families had worked for generations. Celtic tradition often treated respected elders as intermediaries able to speak with ancestors, giving older tribe members real spiritual authority beyond practical daily knowledge. Archaeologists have found Iron Age burial sites where elderly individuals were buried with unusually rich grave goods, suggesting communal respect earned specifically through long survival. Turns out surviving to old age basically meant a noticeably better farewell party than everyone else in the village ever got to have. Now consider what this really meant across the world, because ancient Jomon Japan tells an even quieter version of this exact same pattern. Jomon period communities in ancient Japan relied on rich coastal fishing and gathering, and skeletal studies show many adults living well into their 50s and 60s. Jomon burial customs sometimes positioned elderly individuals in specially marked graves, suggesting their communities recognized old age as its own distinct, respected stage of life. Some excavated Jomon skeletons show healed injuries and worn teeth consistent with individuals who lived past 60, decades beyond the assumed ancient lifespan average. Good seafood and a slower pace of life, apparently, was working thousands of years before any modern wellness trend ever claimed to invent it. One final stop remains before we close this out, all the way across the vast Pacific, for the last comparison this tour has to offer. Ancient Polynesian voyagers who mastered ocean crossings often lived into old age on their home islands, their experience valued because it took decades to build. Polynesian tradition treated elder navigators as living instruments, believed to read stars, currents, and birds in ways only learnable across an entire long lifetime. Oral histories describe elder navigators guiding voyages across thousands of miles of open ocean well into their 60s, passing exact routes down entirely from memory. Out here, nobody trusted the steering to anyone under 60, which sounds either like deep wisdom or the strictest hiring policy in ancient history. One thread ties every stop on this tour together, the single pattern connecting every long-lived elder across every civilization we've just walked through. Here's the twist most people never hear. Anthropologists call it the grandmother effect, real evidence that surviving elders boosted how many grandchildren lived to adulthood. Across this tour, elders weren't rare exceptions surviving against the odds. They were essential, feeding, teaching, and protecting the generation until it could survive alone. So the real story was never about ancient people dying at 30. It was about a species that depended on its oldest members surviving longer. Think about what this means for you, watching this today, descended from an unbroken chain of grandparents who survived long enough to make it possible. You've probably heard ancient people died around 30. Now you know the number wasn't the whole story, and the oldest were the reason it continued.